It was difficult for me to speak until I started to evaporate. I felt horribly burdened and toxic, being rushed through embankments when my desire was for a leisurely meander through the floodplain. Of course, I want to be in the sea. I want to be the sea. That kind of commitment takes time to prepare for. I am celebrated. I have a proud history, and people care a lot about whether they live north or south of me. What is celebrated, though, is my imprisonment. Tightly bound in a mesh of concrete, tunnels, bridges. Today, the sun is blazing, lighting my depths. But all those depths are not just me. With the tide up, I am mostly seawater. I get confused now about where I start and finish. How much of my identity crisis is caused by this twice-daily inundation? Of course, as the subject of the proverbial lesson on impermanence, you can't step in the same river twice. I am bound to have an identity crisis. On days like today, when the sun has polished my surface, I understand civic pride. But most of the time, I feel sick and tired. All these drains, people using poisons, oil, petrol, plastic, bleach, wet wipes. I'm expected to swallow it all. Hormones, rats, cockroaches, mountains of shit, oceans of urine. They still drink me.
Well, I think that the story of the restoration of the River Quaggy can be told in terms of key individuals that were involved and some really good luck and happy coincidence. The whole thing started in 1989 when the NRA were proposing to mitigate flooding in Lewisham through a concrete channelizing scheme that would put the remaining natural or semi-natural parts of the River Quaggy into a huge concrete channel. But by coincidence, I had someone staying with me from America who was a geographer, and he told me that this whole issue of how to treat rivers in urban spaces was a new thing in America, and people were talking about possibly concreting not being the best option. He gave me the name of someone here in this country that I was very surprised when I discovered that the person actually worked for the same organisation that was planning to do this concreting scheme. However, I called him up anyway. He gave us the name of someone else, Ted Hollis, Dr. Ted Hollis, who worked for University College London. Without him, we really wouldn't have got off the ground. He enlightened us about stormwater storage, talked about slowing the water down. He advised governments worldwide on their water policy, and yet he came and sat with 3 or 4 of us around this kitchen table and helped us as a small bunch of idealists searching for a way to fulfill our dream of the potential that we thought we could see. Without him, we would never have overcome that very first hurdle, which was a lot of unchallenged technical argument using ideas and methods that have been around for the last 30 years. After about a year of meetings with the engineers of the National Rivers Authority, I think it was in 1992, we talked about various sites for stormwater storage. Again and again, we felt that Sutcliffe Park was not only big enough but in a key position, and I wanted us to revisit this. Now, when we got to this particular meeting, there were more engineers than there'd ever been before. It felt like the whole army had been brought out with the big guns to finally finish off our arguments. I opened the meeting by asking again to return to Sutcliffe Park. The first engineer said, we cannot flood Sutcliffe Park because it sits above all the surrounding roads, and therefore all the water would run off the park and into the road. I had just come back from picking up some photos. Amongst them was a photo that clearly showed that Sutcliffe Park was not above the surrounding roads, but in fact was below them. Anyway, I was shuffling around in my bag, and the second engineer to the left of the first one said pretty much the same thing. By engineer 4, I got my photo out and I passed it to the chair. The chair looked at the photo and his face dropped, and the chair closed the meeting immediately, saying that they all looked fools, that they had clearly not done their job, and that he promised absolutely that the next meeting we had, they would have seriously looked at using Sutcliffe Park for stormwater storage. And at that next meeting, not only did they say we were right, and Sutcliffe Park did present a solution, it presented a solution that saved them millions of pounds. Sutcliffe Park, being in the borough of Greenwich, a different borough from the borough where the flooding occurred, revealed a political dimension to river restoration. So we'd won the scientific argument, won the engineers over, but now we needed to extend that holistic approach to rivers to political responsibilities. Lewisham was at risk of flooding, but Greenwich not, and the solution was in Greenwich. We successfully managed to argue for a public meeting in Greenwich to determine what local people felt, and another key individual stepped onto the stage of the River Quaggy restoration project. Details were presented at that meeting describing the removal of the football pitches and replacing them with a meandering river, and one person stood up and spoke against this proposal. A 17-year-old young man named Steve, normally shy and reticent, stood up and transfixed the whole meeting with his plea that not all young men wanted to play around on a football pitch. And he described his own passion for birds and wildlife and how wonderful he thought this change would be to the park. He got rousing applause. The councillors and officers, the sort of politicians involved, had a bit of a road to Damascus experience. Steve, who spoke at that meeting, at that time was struggling at school. He didn't have any qualifications, but he had a real passion, and he got involved with the River Quaggy. He then went on to get a job with the RSPB. He left London, and he made a very successful career in this area. Many years later, Steve was coming back from advising the Malaysian government on setting up a nature reserve in Malaysia, and his plane was held in a holding pattern above southeast London, and as it circled above London, he looked down and he saw, for the first time for himself, a finished Sutcliffe Park with a meandering river running across it, the thing that he had dreamed of as a boy with his passion for nature and wildlife.
we love rivers and we're volunteers, and some of us have some ecological training somewhere in our backgrounds. But what we're doing is a watching brief on the health of local rivers. So we sample once a month at various sites on the river catchment, and this is one of the sites. Why am I getting in here? Because the river's got what's called a riffle, which means that the flow is wobbly over some gravel, and that's a more highly oxygenated stretch of a river generally. So I'm just going to see if I can rustle up anything from under the stones. It's a nationwide scheme. It was started off with anglers. See if you can find something moving, and there, for instance, is a freshwater shrimp.
So by putting in hedges in like this, we're creating habitats for birds and bats and the insects which will sustain these populations, really. Unfortunately, the people who make the decisions tend to all come from, they're lawyers, or they've got a background in economics or something. They've got no understanding at all of earth sciences. It'd be great if the council had an ecology officer, had a nature conservation section to actually, one, advise, and two, lead projects like this.
One of the last things I got involved in as chair of QUAG was Centre of Lewisham, and that seemed like such a big opportunity. Many millions of pounds being spent to rearrange the roads and put up major development, and there we've got two rivers coming together. It felt like it was a chance to not just restore the river in places where somebody had to go and look for it, but to restore the river in a place where everybody would see it. There was a public consultation exercise in which clearly the most important thing for everybody was green space and rivers. There was an opportunity to create a walkway along the river, but because that walkway might have taken people away from the new piece of development, the developers would not touch it. But the really important thing is that it takes away the potential to do anything, because once this development goes up and the tower blocks are there and the concrete is in place, that's all the potential that's to do something with them is gone. Now, another happy coincidence. In 2013 there was a proposal here, just touched the bottom of my garden, to build a block of flats. I'd had a number of discussions with the developers about it, and they had insisted that they couldn't restore the river because the Environment Agency had told them not to. So we had a meeting here, and we're all sat around this table, and I suggested that perhaps we could phone the Environment Agency. The person in charge of the developers group put the phone on speakerphone, and she called him up, and we did our little introductions around the table. And when it got to me, he said, "Oh, Matthew, it's good to hear from you." He said, "But Jack Hayes was somebody who had come on a volunteering event that I organised. It's a big event, 600 people who came. But the Environment Agency like to come to these things because a lot of them, poor people, they love rivers and yet they sit behind desks most of the time. You could just see all their faces fall."
When I used to come here with my son when he was young, I mean, we could easily be the only people in the park. It felt windswept, isolated. If you have a river, as we have now, you could have walks around it, you could have bridges over it, you can create wildlife around it. And I think everyone knew that the River Moselle was culverted, because you could look through the gaps in the park and see the river running. A course, there was always the problem that everyone knew how polluted it was, so that was always an issue, and it continues to be an issue. Would we have known that perhaps in other parts of London they had done it down the Quaggy? The Friends is one part of the Lordship Rec Users Forum, which was an umbrella structure of all the different groups, and we started trying to bring in lots of stakeholders, lots of groups that had an interest in the park, and as well as Haringey and Broadwater Farm Estate and anyone who might have an interest. I mean, it wasn't their idea to bring the river back. It was our idea, that we put forward as a suggestion, but they were totally involved in the putting together of the plans. It's the result of having a model of redevelopment that was truly from the community up, and that brought in all the, everyone who had an interest in the park right from the beginning. Very collaborative form of decision making and working. Very transparent. But what we would hope for the river, absolutely, something that looked clearer, looked cleaner, didn't generate a lot of algae that would float to the surface and be mistaken for poo. Something that volunteers could get into. It is not as easy. It's not that easy to get all the misconnections sorted out. And of course, every day there's probably another misconnection being made. And also that it would certainly, the smell would be, there would be less smell if the water was better, and therefore, to be honest, I think it must be very unpleasant for people living at both ends of it at the moment. Yeah, it's not. It would affect the insects. Yes, there's not enough dissolved oxygen, for the insects and fish, and you couldn't have fish and insects. But the birds, it doesn't seem to harm the birds. I mean, the moorhens seem to love it. I mean, it doesn't seem to worry the birds at all. They seem to be able to cope. I started off by saying how few people use the wreck, and now look at it, toing and froing over the bridges, meandering around the river. Yes, and they've no idea what blood, sweat and tears went into creating it. So they just think it's always been like this. Which, as I said, when I was here with my son and we were the only ones in the park, and then I see all these families, all meeting each other and, all joining together and everything. I feel quite envious of them in a way, and thinking, I wish it had been like that. Yeah, I wish it had been like this when he was there.
In London, it's quite interesting the way that our sewer network works. So we have a combined sewer system which takes all of the runoff from bathrooms, roads, rainwater, and takes it to a sewage treatment plant, and then we'll treat it and then release it into the rivers much cleaner. However, there are certain parts in London which use a separate sewer system, which is you have one for your foul water and one for your rainwater. The problem with misconnections is that occasionally people can plumb in pipes from their bathrooms into the wrong sewer, so therefore you've got bathroom water going into the rainwater sewer and therefore going straight out into the river instead of being treated in the water treatment plant, which is where you get issues with water quality, because you can get the interconnection between foul water and surface water, and it just makes all water much more polluted, and that's the problem in London.
I think we stumbled into being interested in the river because a culvert, the big culvert, started erupting across the diagonal line across the field in the park. So there are no hills in the park, and we were suddenly getting a hill. Quite a big hill, which meant that you couldn't sort of run about or play football. We realised that the Stonebridge Brook may be in that culvert. And so we kind of stumbled into river surfacing as a result of stumbling over the erupting culvert. Also, the drainage of the main field has failed. Drainage ditches were dug there in the year 2000, and those ditches have now sunk, so instead of being a proper field you can run about on and play kickabout games or running, you fall into these gravel ditches all the time. According to the engineers, that's not rising, it's just that the whole of the rest of the park is falling. Initially we thought the river belonged to Thames Water because it was a major river. He then established that actually it only starts being a major river at the junction of Calvert Road and Grove Road. It's classed by the Environment Agency as a main river. I think it's Thames Water anyway, and it discharges here into the Lee in Markfield Park. The Moselle discharges just above it. Where it travels under the park, it belongs to the Parks Department, so the Parks Department is responsible for a potentially failing culvert. So they commissioned a culvert survey that took place on the 8th of January this year, but what they did discover is that there's very little water. This is probably a storm drain. And that right at the top of the park here, there's this concrete culvert which is, you can walk in it. It's huge, person height. But what they found up here, which is so romantic, which is there are side channels coming into this big concrete culvert, and what they discovered, looking through a side channel, you can see a parallel river running in an old Victorian brick culvert. The water was fresh smelling. Yeah. Instead of running through right across the park, it just runs through the northwest corner of the park. So there's all this historical, romantic sort of notion that the water's there. If we brought the water up, the driver would be the Environment Agency's funding to prevent flood. And that's why all the young people are down there right now as we speak, dancing on Waterloo Bridge, I hope.
Yes, I mean, it's a big concern,
London Borough of Haringate's flood prevention team have been invited to make quite a major bid to the Environment Agency for the first step of a big feasibility, which will include crawling in this romantic and interesting brick culvert here. The idea is if we brought even that small bit of river up there, that there would be the opportunity to, in times of flood, capture the water in a floodplain in Chestnuts Park and stop an amount of water flowing downstream.
But the other odd thing about the situation we have with our rivers now is the hold they have on our imagination when they're not there. And so I'm a late convert to the idea that the rivers in our imagination might be rivers in reality. And once it became apparent that the old Wood Green Gasworks was going to be demolished for a housing development, the presence of this river became a bit of a preoccupation. So I would reflect on the fact that at the end of our garden the streams that gather in an arc to the west of us here, Highgate Woods, right round to some of the area, Channing School and Highgate itself. It appears for a few feet in as it comes under the railway line, entering the area that's known as the Heartland. And then, to our amazement, we discovered by trespassing that under a grill next to the old first gasometer, you can see the Moselle a few feet underground. But as the planning application came forward from National Grid, the orthodoxy was that the Moselle was too deep underground to be for any consideration to restoring it. The Atkins, the engineers for National Grid, discovered that the river was in a more polluted condition than people would have anticipated. And that relates to Haringate's enormous problem of mostly domestic misconnection. They use the European Union Bathing Water Quality Directive as the yardstick that they want to see achieved if the rivers to be opened. And of course, that's very unlikely to be achieved. There are legitimate concerns about how much water flow there will be. A council like Haringey has massive pressures on social justice. There are far too many people who don't have adequate housing. So the strategy for the Moselle, which is, with a few exceptions in Haringey, a hidden river, is to expose it at every point where that is possible. The sort of most serious opportunity, which I would argue is the full length of Carbuncle Passage in Tottenham, and then the culverts that cross Clendish Marsh. And so the possibility there of introducing a wetland. We are in Haringey pursuing the idea of what you might call micro exposures, really quite short stretches of water. So whereas traditionally these have been regarded as not feasible or not meaningful, we think that within the idea of restoring the river's identity, making it visible, public, part of a common ownership, in fact these sort of short statements, exclamation marks, it's not just that you put up a post saying here lies the River Moselle, it's that you open up a section of it and say here is the River Moselle, where else is it? It's very exciting that we've got this partnership now with the Engineering Exchange at University College London, who are involved in a Thames Basin-wide initiative with Thames 21 and other partners, whereby we're going to try and get local groups involved in testing water quality at all the places where you can access the Moselle. So once we've got this collaboration with students and local residents going out as citizen scientists and to build up a data picture of the river, then in a way we've created a kind of shadow map of the river with people involved at all stages of it. So it follows from that if we can test the water quality at these points, then we can challenge for the river itself to be brought back and open.
So, if you could
diverse planting, really.
divert the river into it and then back out, so it actually does something for the river.
Generally, this is not touched during the summertime, is it?
No, it's not. It grows. It's lovely.
Yes.
They do die back. Wetlands in winter.
Part of my role at Thames 21 was to do a project called community modelling. It's been running for the last year and a half, and it was a way of empowering local people with tools and models such as flood risk and water quality models. We would engage with them about the environmental problems such as Enfield with their misconnections and water quality issues, and we would test what would happen if you put a series of wetlands all across the catchments for the Pimsbrook and Salmonsbrook and see how much they could improve water quality and reduce flood risk for the entire catchment. So that started a year and a half ago, and from that we now have 2 groups that work actively in the area, talking to the council, talking to other people in the local area and getting people more aware of why we should improve the water quality of the Pimsbrook and Salmonsbrook, and also why wetlands are a good way of improving water quality and flood risk, as well as providing a new area for people to walk their dogs and enjoy the environment in. Part of the problem in London is that we've inherently canalised our rivers and just tried to get the water out of the catchment as quick as possible to reduce flooding to the area, which, although is good, there's a new kind of science over the last 20 years maybe that has shown that if you actually use things like wetlands, sustainable drainage systems, you can improve the areas as well as create benefits that would reduce the flood risk. So it's about having those conversations with residents, with councils, with developers, to make them aware that there are alternative approaches that can be used to improve rivers, make it much better. A lot of our rivers suffer from pollution issues, and one of the ways that it can get into the rivers is by a first flush event. So this happens when you get dry periods of no rainfall, and then a lot of sediment and things like oils will build up on the roads. When you get a rainfall event, such as we've had today, all of the rain will just wash and collect all that sediment into the rivers, and then you'll get a drop in dissolved oxygen, which will be bad for the fish because it means they can no longer breathe, so then you can get high levels of fish kills.
There's a sewer system that was built by Joseph Bazalgette in the 1860s and 70s, which runs west to east, north of the river and south of the river. It had some overflows built into it for when the system overflows. So the system would overflow if there's heavy rain, because a combined sewer, it's got stormwater, rainwater and sewage in it. So it was the Fleet River that was then covered over, lost to London. And it was designed to overflow 4 or 5 times a year into the river. Now that's basically not a problem, because the river has enough biological action that it can break down the sewage. As the size of London increases and the amount going into these sewer systems increases, the overflows are now happening more like 40 to 50 times a year. So we're now overcoming the biological action of the river, so we're harming the river. The river starts to get to a state where it can't deal with the sewage anymore. So it takes oxygen to break down the sewage. There's not enough oxygen left in the river because it's being used up by all the sewage. That means fish die, plants die. Added to that is the fact that it's tidal. So it's not that we just flush sewage in and it goes out to the sea, or flush it in and it ends up going backwards and forwards. We are basically building an extension to the overflow. So when the overflow operates, it will continue to operate, but we will capture it inside a tunnel and take it to the sewage treatment works. So the 40 to 50 overflows that happen a year will stop, and the quality of the river will improve within 3 months. What goes into the river when the overflow operates is basically everything bad that anybody ever puts down the sewer. You know, it's not like there is a specialised system within the sewage network to separate things off. It overflows automatically when there's too much rain. So it is disgusting when the overflow operates. You can see it, you can hear it, you can smell it. It's basically a big dark cloud of water, because it's mostly rainwater, but it is filled with all disgusting things that you can imagine.
Bazalgette, who was a genius, persuaded Parliament through a lot of hard persuasion that he needed to build a tunnel that would a sewage system that could be for 4 million people, when London's population at the time was about 1.9 to 2 million. So he wanted to do it for double that, and Parliament was very sceptical. They didn't believe that London would get that big. And in fact, by 1950 we'd gone past 4 million, and we're now at 8.6, and we're nearly at 10 by 2030 easily. So this is a 7.2 metre diameter tunnel. It is massive to take all the overflows out. So it's got the capacity to last for at least another 150, if not longer, years. The tunnel itself will take about another 1.5 years to build, and that's including what's happening in the east and in the west, which is not our section, because it's divided into 3 construction sections. And then there'll be fit out, there'll be testing, and we expect by 2024 the tunnel will be fully operational. So within about 6 or 9 months of that, that's when you really will notice how clean the river has got biologically.
I was asked about 8 years ago, 2011, to chair a group of 5 people who were all, in one form or another, experts on water schemes. And it was a concern of 5 of the London boroughs that the proposal, which was being favoured, didn't take sufficient account of environmental issues. It was simply a remake of the Victorian solution, which was one big tunnel. So we wanted complementary green infrastructure solutions, and particularly try and separate freshwater and sewage, and not put the two together. Remember that in Victorian times, the main mode of travel was horse-drawn carts. So any rain which fell on a road immediately got connected with horse manure. So that wasn't very different from human sewage. So it was reasonable to put the two together. But nowadays you've got sewage, you've got grey water, and you've got rainwater, which, if it's separated quickly, has enormous opportunities for recycling. You could use it for cleaning cars, you could use it for irrigating sports fields. Many uses. There are enormous opportunities to plan for flood management, and at the same time to plan for separation of grey and polluted water. Open spaces of water. They can act as a sump for the flood water, and we wanted to see each area come up with their own local proposals, and we would have liked to have seen a local sewage works put in underground. Now this has been done in other cities, but they went for the massive tunnel, whereas we had a much more decentralized approach. And of course the objection to that from the central government was that the central government wanted to make sure that if the European Union imposed infraction proceedings against the British government under the Urban Wastewater Directive, the government would want to know who was going to pick up the bill, which could be enormous, if you're being fined so much a day for having unacceptable levels of pollution in the River Thames at London. They wanted to make sure that there was one organisation who could be held to account, and that would have been the Thames Water. But we did want to put together all the massive advances that have been over the last 30 or 40 years, and indeed implemented in cities all around the world. We wanted to see them all put together with a scheme which allowed local communities to contribute to determining priorities. There's enormous appetite from local communities to get involved in water resource management. It'll be common practice to have porous parking places, so you don't have everything run off. Green roofs, which will be again common. People will have the sense to separate when they're flushing water. They'll separate their bath water from their lavatory water. And all these will reduce the amount of water which has to go in the tunnel.
There's a new way of thinking of rivers as assets. Increasingly people understand that flooding is a problem in London, something that's going to be increasingly a problem unless we find other ways to deal with it. So while the Thames Tideway tunnel, which runs beside the river, is the big infrastructure solution, the other end of the scale is community-driven projects which allow rivers to be restored and small floodplains to be created in part. And I think it's right to say that communities started that process off, and now local authorities have begun to get in on the act. But rivers are something that are owned by their local community, at least in spirit. And I think the reason that people really understood what role their rivers could play and how they could be improved and given respect and made part of a place is because they felt an instinctive connection to them. And whether broader authorities, people looking after entire boroughs, have that understanding of place and its connection to waterways is another matter.
We would have a lot cleaner water, we would have a lot less flood risk, and we would also have environments where people could come, connect with the water, get closer to nature and actually understand just how important rivers are. We would see a lot more wetlands put in around, so say for example Enfield has some first farm wetlands. We would see a lot more sud systems, so by that I mean sustainable drainage systems all along the road. So you would take road runoff pollutants and clean it, and we would just have generally much happier and healthier ecosystems for rivers, so you'd have more fish, you'd have more variation within a river, and it would return to a much more natural state, less managed, which would be brilliant.
Let's get